first of all, thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. I'll try not to speak too quickly for the organizers. There's a buzz going on. Oh, perfect. Okay, good. For the translators, I could speak in French, but for economics, better in English. And when I saw the conference program, I saw I was on with Joji and also with Adebayo, and both presenting on social policy and talking about autonomous pathways. And I suggested to Ndongo and Kai and Maha that perhaps I should change my presentation and talk about social policy as well. But they told me no, to stand firm and to keep talking about what they asked me to talk about. So I suppose in this sense what my presentation is really doing is framing the question, autonomy from what, right? Alternatives from what? Deconnecting, delinking from what? And so sort of have an understanding of where we are actually in terms of then what you're trying to go from. Is that okay? Is it too loud? Okay. Oh, sorry. Oh, so that, I guess okay. And so what I'm trying to do is to add a perspective on the conditions and constraints that that an agenda of an autonomous pathway of development would faces around the question of what fundamentally drives external indebtedness from a developmentalist perspective. Hence the reason why I have developmentalism there. And also, I thought I would also, as I was preparing the presentation, I was doing some updates on my data on Zambia, and because in the last conference in 2019, I gave this whole presentation on Zambia, and I thought I would actually focus a bit on that as well, in a way to emphasize the urgency and the severity of the situation that we're actually in right now, in terms of the destruction of any basis of autonomy, actually, which I think is a really important point to make. I had also had the ambition of perhaps saying some comments about China, but I'll probably run out of time, so if what you can do is you can, in the question period, if you wish, you can ask me about China, and then I'll give you my thoughts. But anyways, but first of all, let's see if this works. Which one do I press? The arrow. Wonderful. So what I would say is that I think there's a lot of assumptions that that you read in a lot of the emerging developmental state literature, because there's this whole new renewed interest in developmental states. Also the neo-developmentalism school, as it's called, around Bresser Pereira and other people in Latin America, and also some of the post-Keynesian literature, like the balance of payments, constrained growth, the Thirlwellian school, and so on. And the assumption is basically that finance, in a sense, is external finance is a bad thing. Dependence on external finance is a bad thing, and you avoid it as much as you can. And so it sort of goes by successive logical steps, which is that one, successful industrializers, as we've been talking about several times today, typically the East Asians, ran trade surpluses, or export orientation resulted in trade surpluses, right? So you export and then you have a surplus. And then that finances development, and then you therefore avoid dependence on external finance. And therefore, logically, countries should not rely on an external finance, but focus on exporting instead. And we had a bit of a discussion about that this morning. And in this sense, developmentalism is conceived as a solution to the problems of dependency, right? Now, the thing is, I understand the political messaging about this, because in Brazil, for instance, with the extent of financialization that many countries are dealing with, any effort to try and de-emphasize the centrality of finance and development is probably a good message to make. But empirically and historically, the problem with the message is that in actual fact, the East Asian economies that inform this idea did not actually run trade surpluses. They ran, for a significant period of time, trade deficits. And relied on aid and finance, external finance, quite heavily for an extended period of time. Now, the key question there is that was combined with what we consider to be successful industrial policy and structural transformation. But the key is that it needed two wings to fly, right? One of the wings alone would probably have not taken off the ground in that sense, although people have different ideas, but it's usually based on counterfactuals that you can never prove. So, I mean, this is just to give you a demonstration of South Korea, which I've worked on and written on. And it's, I don't have a pointer here, I believe, but if I did, I'd point some. If you see the bottom dotted line there, that's actually the goods trade deficit of South Korea. That was in deep deficit for a good 30-year period as it was going through its successive stages of both import substitution and export-oriented industrialization, which in the first period in the 50s was mostly financed by aid, but then you had debt taking over. And also, critically, a point I always like to emphasize is that when the 1982 crisis hit, Korea was actually in a very vulnerable situation as well, and it was, one of the factors that kept it out away from falling into crisis was this big, huge surge in official lending to South Korea in the late 70s and early 80s. That was tied, of course, to adjustment programs in the late 70s, but nonetheless, they were implemented in a way that was tolerant of the continuation of industrial policy at that period. Obviously for geopolitical reasons, we know that story, I think. But nonetheless, it's not, where there is a will, there is a way, right? I think that's the point here. There is the geopolitical will to allow this situation to happen and to finance it, but basically the model was based on a long-term sustained financing of deep, deep trade deficits to be able to finance the industrialization experience. So that's what I refer to as the dialectic. And what I mean by that is that basically, you have coming out of the colonial period dependence on foreign finance, and you're only primary commodity producers, and you are importing most of your industrial goods and most of your processed goods and so on. And that's your starting point. But the point there is that then this condition is reproduced and even intensified by the process of industrialization itself. So that developmentalism, in this sense, wasn't a solution to dependency, at least in the short and medium term, but it was actually reinforcing the conditions of dependency as countries were industrializing. Dependency, in this case, particularly on international finance. And that's, of course, because of the import intensity of the industrialization process, late industrialization, the dependence on capital, intermediate goods. We even see that in China today with how effectively the US can create turmoil in its semiconductor industry, because basically China is still depending at the top level of technology on inputs from the US, for instance. But also including all of economic infrastructure, which is extremely import dependent. I mean, I come into Dakar and I keep asking, who built this, who built that, the French, the Turks, this, that, and it's like, it's all import dependence. And external finance dependent. I just gave some examples there: ports, transportation, telecom, mobile phone network. When Kenya first set up their mobile phone network, it apparently cost $3 billion. So before you even can talk about farmers benefiting from better prices on markets through their mobile phone, you have to lay down 3 billion euros or US dollars before you can even get there, and these types of things. I also, you can think of it at the firm level. I like to give the example of Ethiopian Airlines. I think Ethiopian Airlines is a profitable company. Maybe I can be corrected, but I think they're generating a decent profit. But if you would look at it in balance of payments terms, as a firm, they're probably running a balance of payments deficit. So a successful industrialization strategy around the development of a national airline that's a good example of something that would be heavily import dependent, even though it's playing certain critical roles within their economic strategy, as long as they don't sell it off now under liberalization and privatization. And this was especially the case as countries were moving into second generation import substitution industrialization policies in the 70s, both in East Asia and Latin America, for instance. And I think this is I emphasize this point because it's a foundational insight for me to early structuralism in development economics, as in the CEPEL structuralism of Latin America, and also early dependency theory. If you think of one of the first person to really start articulating the concept of dependency was perhaps Celso Furtado in the 50s, and he was precisely referring to this context whereby as Brazil was starting to rapidly industrialize in the 50s, it was constantly running against these balance of payments constraints, which were then constantly throwing it into crisis, which you can see there in that the part in the graph there just showing the 50s, you're just seeing in the absence at that point of foreign finance being constantly, the industrialization efforts being constantly basically knocked out at the knees and then having to restart. And that was the context in which Celso Furtado started to refer to dependency not as the colonial origin, but as the reinforcement through an industrialization process. So I think it's a message that's important to keep in mind when we talk about industrialization, precisely because as you pursue a strategy of industrialization, you're likely going to reinforce your demand for finance in that sense. I mean, this is just an argument I've made here in one of my papers about how we could argue that the top dark line is South Korea, the bottom is Brazil, and you can see, especially in the 50s and the early 60s, how, you know, you could argue that Korea's success of massively expanding exports was predicated on a pre-existing ability to import, which was financed externally through aid and debt. And in the absence, with a lag of about 5 to 10 years, which is what we typically see in industrial policy. So, and in the absence of that, it's quite unlikely that they wouldn't have had that type of success. So basically the idea here is that developmentalism actually accentuates rather than solves dependence in that sense, right? Forex becomes a constraint as distinct from savings and aggregate demand. External accounts tend to dominate other macroeconomic variables, not all the time, but when push comes to shove, or whatever the expression you wish to choose. And insufficient Forex imposes austerity through quantity adjustments rather than price adjustments. I think it's probably, we'll probably hear this coming up again by constraining investment and consumption in that sense, right? And it can be overcome through either right prices or demand management. Neither. This is the structuralist critique of both neoclassical and Keynesian economics. A good example of that is the inflation debates in the 1950s, and again, Brazil. The point is that you couldn't solve this through either of those two approaches. And it was also the early rationale for aid in a lot of the original structuralist sort of pioneers of development economics. You know, the majority of who were from the peripheries. And the argument there was that, you know, the argument for aid, you can conceive it as in whatever form you wish, it was precisely, it wasn't to finance all of the investment needs, but it was to cover this critical margin of the balance of payments to allow the industrialization process, which was mostly domestically financed, to not stall or be undermined in that sense. And also you have this nice symbiosis where a trade deficit actually allows for the absorption of aid in macroeconomic terms, whereas actually if you run a trade surplus, you don't actually absorb in that sense in macroeconomic terms either the aid or the debt in that sense, which is kind of a tricky issue that's now largely ignored. I'll just skip over that point, but you know, so a lot of the ideas of this were informed by the Marshall Plan, for instance, which is based on the same idea. The Marshall Plan wasn't intended to finance the reconstruction of Europe, which was mostly financed by Europe, but it was giving that little extra that was avoiding balance of payments crises that were emerging as reconstruction was taking place. But also you could argue in terms of colonial transfers, which I know Jason Hickel probably would have talked about, in terms of how, you know, yes, Europe might well have largely financed its own industrialization. The key point of colonial transfers were not so much about giving the majority of the investment into the industrialization process, but was allowing key countries in Europe to balance their balance payments, which I think is a common argument that Ndongo and Kay and others talk about in terms of France's use of the CFA and so on. And we can have, I don't know how I'm doing in time, I forgot to bring my watch, but I'm not going to talk much about climate change, even though it was in my title, but you have similar considerations with respect to climate change insofar as we conceive of climate change. That's an article I wrote on it. If we conceive of, say, constructing an economic infrastructure in the South that maximizes its potential for decarbonization, earlier, before lunch, the person who was talking, I forget his name, was talking about the solar panels, for instance, right? It's again extremely import intensive, and hence would tend to be forex exchange. So if you're making an argument for a decarbonization type of growth model in the global south, as this Margvin did in this paper we were responding to, you would be facing the similar challenges and a need for massive expanding redistribution to be able to finance that. What I would suggest is that, if anything, these structural conditions have been intensifying over the last, decades. With some exemptions, the dependence on capital and intermediate inputs is increasingly inelastic based on structures of production and consumption that countries are more and more linked into, which raises the question of delinking, which I think some of you were asking in the last presentation as well. And of course, we constantly fall back on the fundamental problem that the insufficiency of foreign exchange is always dealt with through austerity, basically by reductions or destructions of investment and consumption, which I'll show you in a moment in the case of Zambia. Example, to quote Tandika Makandawiri, Africa's Great Depression was characterized, one of the fundamental characterizations of the Great Depression was this severe austerity in foreign finance. And one could argue that, the simplest explanation for the recovery of growth in the 2000s onwards was quite simply through the relaxing of the external constraints in that sense. And for me, I think this is the simplest counter-argument to the World Bank IMF position. In the late 2000s, they started to say, mea culpa, maybe we were wrong, maybe we were too harsh with structural adjustment policies in destroying investment and growth and so on. But then as soon as growth started taking off in the 2010, 11, 12, then they were like, oh, no, this is the devastation we caused for 25 years, like scorched earth policy, was actually this is the result now. The growth we're experiencing now was because of our policies, right? Whereas the simplest counter-argument for that is it's quite simply is you put people in a straitjacket and then they can't breathe, and as soon as you take away the straitjacket, they start breathing again, right? So that's essentially what we're talking about. But as soon as they start to breathe again, they have a long list, as you've all been saying, of development priorities, all their development projects, 100 development projects that they wish to invest in immediately as soon as they can get access to some funding. And pretty much all of them have intensive, huge foreign exchange demands, right? So, and in that sense, I think it's crucial also to really differentiate between domestic and external in this sense. And if I can just reinforce this point, I say the MMT case, perhaps, the domestic financing and priorities, and this is where I can slip in a bit of my social protection work, because what really struck me as I was doing research on, say, the external financing of social protection was that even in a context of, say, Zambia in 2017, 2018, 2019, where they were having really severe difficulties with external finance, they were in protracted negotiations with the IMF, which finally resulted in default and now a program. Even in that context, the domestic policies that were entirely or mostly domestically financed, they were able to finance, right? So if anything, what they told the donors through their green paper was that they were going to allocate 1,428 billion kwacha to the farmer import the support program, which the World Bank and the IMF for 20 years has been telling them to get rid of, but they actually ended up spending, 3 times that amount of money. And partly that was also because of the drought, but the whole point is that when you have a drought, this is a very effective program, as Grieve Shelwa also makes the point. And Tandiko Makandawiri was also emphasized that a lot, about how this farmer input subsidy programs, no matter how all the problems with them and so on, they were more comprehensive and general and universal in that sense than the social cash transfers, which were very targeted, narrowly targeted and so on. And even though the donors were telling, Zambia to put money into social cash transfer, ultimately they said, yeah, but, again, their priority was not there, and you could see when push came to shove, they just basically only spent about 1/6 the amount of money on it. And you can see that they're able to follow their own policy preferences when it comes to the domestic sphere. Hence the reason I call it the MMT case. I'm not sure, I'll probably be corrected on that. But then what I call the MMT oblivion then is when we come to the external financial needs of the government, where you have, if I can just emphasize this point, about 30%, this was in 2019, so just before they defaulted, the year before they defaulted, about 30% of their government expenditure was in foreign exchange, right? So, and if we look at what this was mostly targeted on, out of the 26 billion kwacha, about 25 billion kwacha was going into non-financial assets. So this is rural electrification schemes, this is roads, this is perhaps building stadiums, I'm not sure, water and sanitation and so on. So all of these things having a huge demand of foreign exchange. And of course, you know, I was asking Grieve Chelwa at this point, within the revenue side, the government doesn't actually reveal how much foreign exchange they're earning on the revenue side. And the question is, do things like mining royalties, do they get paid in foreign exchange or domestic currency, for example? And actually, Grieve asked around for me and came back to me with the answer that he thinks they're paid in domestic currency. So you have this government that's extremely constrained in terms of, especially on the investment side, pretty much their entire investment portfolio is constrained by how much foreign exchange they can raise in that sense. So when they're then shoved into, you know, a program with the IMF, all of that goes to crap, basically. And what you see here, it's interesting, because this is the current account of Zambia, and I'd want to emphasize, of course, this last period, where you see, after a period of much difficulty, when the thick black line, which is the current account balance, is below zero, and that's when they were having protracted negotiations with the IMF. Then you see the current account balance going into a massive surplus. Yay, we're all happy, right? Because that's what we say. They have to generate a surplus to finance their development. But what's actually underlying that is well, the next slide, what's underlying that is a complete collapse in imports. So for the first time since '78, normally imports collapse as export revenues collapse. But in this case, under the recent IMF program, well, from default onwards, what you see is exports improved because of rising prices, basically, and yet imports were just driven down into the ground, which is what you see the red line there going down, and that's why you have the surplus. So the surplus is partly because of rising prices in copper, but it's also a large part of it is through the suppression of consumption and investment, right? Or the stalling of investment projects and so on. And simultaneous to that, you have, if you look at the well, the net errors and emissions is just suddenly a huge bunch of errors. But the primary, the red line, is basically profit remittances. So those are this is what goes to Suad's, Aden Osman's, what she was talking about in terms of where she says we don't really need to understand more. I'll present this and see what you say afterwards, because I think this I think is very, very subtle. Because the red line is as you were saying, it's not the illicit flows, it's the officially recorded profit remittances, mostly by mining companies, largely Western, also Chinese, and maybe supermarket. What's the supermarket chain called in Zambia again? The South African one? Yeah, ShopRite, yeah, exactly. So you can see that sinking down, but what's interesting is this is what I wrote about a few years ago, and I need to update it, because what's happening on the financial account parallel to the current account, so the financial account is like the inverse of the current account. So some people say we don't need to look at it, because it's just the mirror image of the current account. But what's interesting is that's what all the details inside the financial account, and what you essentially see happening here, underlying this, the surging financial account, which is the black line, is this other one called other investment, right? Now this is according to the international investment position. So what it's actually saying is that simultaneous to this whole crisis going on, resident Zambians, which could be Glencore Zambia, right, are building up debt assets abroad, right? So there's this huge accumulation of debt assets abroad, and it's hidden away in the financial account in a way that when I was looking at the financial account, I was observing this stuff, but I was observing it around 2012, 13, and I went to the Bank of Zambia, talked to some really good people there who were actually working on this, and they said, yeah, well, actually, it's basically an error and omission. It should have therefore been put in the errors and omissions, but they stuck it in here and hid it away, and no one had noticed it besides me. But they had been discussing with the IMF on what to do about it. And they think by comparing it with the Bank of International Settlements data, that it is basically illicit profit remittances, probably dominated by the mining companies, because pretty much everything in Zambia is dominated by the mining companies. But just to give you an example, I mean, if I have time to explain the details a bit more, the black line is the other investment category, so it's the red line that we saw there, right? And then if you break down the other investment category, besides the portfolio liabilities, which is a separate category, what you have is the dotted green line is these debt instruments, other sectors, which just was, for instance, in 2012, it was 20% of GDP. $5 billion left the Zambian economy, or 20% of its GDP left the Zambian economy as debt instruments of other sectors, assets, like resident Zambians, which could be Glencore Zambia, moving and buying debt assets abroad. I was like, what is this, right? But it's basically probably illicit profit remittances in that sense, being hidden away in this category. And what I find amazing here is that, so parallel to basically 2020, the default 21 negotiations with the IMF, preparing for the IMF program, I don't have the data yet for 22, is we see this, after it had calmed down a bit, up to about 2019, exploded. And we are currently at, in 2021, when the economy was generating this massive trade surplus, you had the outflow of about $4.5 billion from the economy, about 21% of GDP in 1 year, flowing through that single category, basically, as an outflow, and then being compensated by increased government indebtedness, as the government, trying to stabilize the situation, is doing more portfolio borrowing, central general government is borrowing, also taking out their special drawing rights, which they finally got to get from the IMF and so on. So it's really like, goes back to Celso Furtado explaining actually how, in a lot of the Latin American ISI policies, it was actually the Latin American government, it was taking on a lot of indebtedness to subsidize the transnational corporate activities in their economies in that sense, which is pretty much what you're seeing happening here. Is the government increasingly subsidizing the massive hemorrhaging of wealth, of assets or whatever, profits, from the economy, which is probably, again, being dominated by the mining sectors. The reason I also think it's the mining companies is because the central bankers I was talking to were saying that their banking sector is actually quite well regulated. So they do a good job at that. And so they know what banks are doing quite well. They have, good regulation in that sense. But the mining companies, which are massive financial actors in the economy, aren't regulated by the mining laws, by the banking, by the central bank. So all of their activities fall outside of any sort of oversight by the central bank, and the central bank simply can't do anything about it, right? So until they would change that, which would mean confronting Glencore, which they did. And what I would be interested to know from, Grieve Chelwa and others is how much some of these dynamics are being affected by the withdrawal of Glencore from the economy last year, for instance. So I don't know if I have time to talk about China, but I do. To talk about China? Oh, yeah, I'm not going to talk first. Well, let me just quickly say about China. I've worked a lot on this, because people, again, in the development state literature and otherwise, China is now today, I think, a lot of the thinking about developing through trade surpluses is informed not by the South Korean experience, maybe somewhat more by the Taiwanese experience, but by the Chinese experience, especially in the 2000s. And I've written about this, and I always give a qualification to that argument, because my PhD and a lot of my experience was in China before I got involved more globally. I mean, this is China's current account, not the balance payments, but the current account. When you have this massive trade surplus in the sort of early to late 2000s, and the other things going on are relatively minor in comparison to that, right? And they've managed to find, although that almost disappeared, that current account surplus, which is the black line as it almost hits the green line in 2018, almost disappeared. We were kind of wondering if it was going to go negative, and the Chinese managed to balance the situation and still are running quite of a strong, good surplus. But I think and this is the financial accounts on the other side. I think what's interesting here, of course, is that the red line there is FDI. So it's negative, which means it's flowing into the country. So basically that's inflow of FDI. And from about 1994 to about 2012-13, net FDI, so that's inflowing FDI minus the Chinese FDI going abroad that everyone talks about and is obsessed about, was actually in the range of 5 to 2%, which was actually much, much higher for a much longer extended period of time than FDI was ever, say, in Brazil. And Brazil is, of course, the model of dependency that Furtado and Cardoso and others were referring to in terms of how FDI became the channel by which transnational corporations would then start to dominate the local economy. So you're seeing much higher levels of FDI, and what actually happens in this process, and what underlies the twin surpluses that emerged during that period, was very much a transitional process. But what I refer to here is that you saw this very rapid denationalization of China's export sector and of its surpluses. So these graphs I've put here are basically showing FFE is foreign funded enterprises, and the majority of, I think about 80% of them are fully funded enterprises. So they are your Walmart, they are your Carrefour, they are your, what's the Taiwanese one that does all those, Foxconn and so on, operating in China, where basically, I didn't put the right axis and the left axis, but the red and blue bars are the left axis and the black line is the right axis, and you see that the foreign funded share of exports reached a peak in about 2008 of almost 60% of China's total exports, and since they've been crawling that back somewhat. And on the other hand, the share of surplus has reached almost over 85% in around 2011, 2012. And so what you had is this basically, the export sector itself was being rapidly denationalized through this process of the heavy insertion of FDI into the economy. The difference with Latin America is that it was channeled into export sectors rather than being channeled into the ISI sectors. But it still was putting China into quite of a tricky situation, which since then, I would say, especially during the term of the first 2 terms of Hu Jintao, who knows about the 3rd term, or the 4th term, or 5th term, and so on. Not Hu Jintao, sorry, Xi Jinping, is that I think during the 2 first terms of Xi Jinping, a lot of what China was trying to do was crawl back this denationalization through various industrial policies that were targeted at crawling this back, which I think they've been successful at doing, but I think that's extremely important to understand the types of now trade conflicts and frictions that they're having with the US, because it's precisely the opposite direction the US was trying to push them in. If you went back 10 years ago or so, I wrote a short little piece for Jomo on that back in 2010 in relationship to the currency wars. So that's just a qualification on the Chinese case, that the period of twin surpluses were associated with a rapid denationalization of trade, and strategies since then have been aimed at crawling back. Trade surpluses became the vehicle for transnational corporate expansion into China, in addition to the capital account. And there's also a lot of misinvoicing on the trade surpluses as well. Some people have estimated that about 25% of the trade surplus was actually misinvoicing. And now we have black squares probably telling me that I have to stop. But I won't go into the last point just because I don't want to take up too much time. But we're seeing, potential volatility on the foreign financial account, which the Chinese government has been controlling. I mean, they burnt through $1 trillion of reserves at one point in 2015-16, but they've been controlling through an increasingly strong interventionist role in the capital accounts and foreign exchange and so on. Also through their control of the banking sector, which still remains largely state-owned, which they've been doing successfully, but in this sense, they're doing successfully as a developmentalist state. They're not yet a core capitalist power. in the sense that these types of actions actually undermine their ability to become capitalist hegemons, in the sense that capitalist hegemons typically need trade and financial liberalization and free movement for people to actually come and go and so on, which is a problem that the Chinese economy still deals with. So hence the reason why I had that picture to talk about the Chinese, but we can't see the picture now. But if I just go back to my conclusion, if we can even see it, I think my conclusion was just saying something like, there we go, delinking from what? Escape from dependence. Yeah, rather than delinking from the international financial system, it highlights the need for major scaling up of redistribution and serious alternatives to current development finance models, international tax systems, as Swad was referring to. Of course, in this presentation, don't give any suggestions of how to do that, but maybe I'll keep working on that. But it has to happen on a foundation, as we've been saying over and over and over again. Joji was saying, of structural transformation, which remains the root cause of development, right? That the external finance, in this sense, is not so much a cause of development, but it's a constraint. It constrains the development, often in negative ways. And by releasing the constraint, you can then let the other development, the processes happen, which might not happen in positive ways. It's not, but the point, though, is that external finance, of course, as we all know, I'm saying the obvious, can be extremely destructive to development, which is unfortunately where we seem to be heading right now, as I was pointing about in the Zambian case, which the Zambian, I was looking at this data from Zambia, and it was actually, I mean, it's desperate. It's like the economy is literally being gutted. So I don't know what the future holds for that, but perhaps we can talk about it more. Thank you.